Oh, I'm on. Huh. Hi, everybody. Mrs. Gladstone, chapter 17 in Finding Zasha. Ooh. That day proved to be one of the longest days ever. About an hour after we'd finished hiding our firewood and food supplies, Galena picked up her phone to call her neighbor. They must have cut the phone lines, she said quietly as she replaced the receiver. Of course, Auntie said. The less we know and the less we communicate with our neighbors, the more powerful they become. We sat in Galena's front room, looking out her big window for any kind of activity. There was none, only sound, and the sounds were confusing. Even 2 blocks away from the main street, we could hear the deep rumbling of the German tanks and trucks. Of course, we couldn't see anything, and there was no one to tell us what was happening. Never had the time passed so slowly. Each minute felt like 10, with the anxiety, anticipation, and inactivity. Hour after hour dragged by. Each of us took a book from Galena's overstuffed bookcase, but none of us could concentrate, and we continued to stare out the window for any sign of what was to come. By afternoon, I felt like I'd been in prison for a week. Leaving the house was out of the question. Staying in felt like torture. I was weary from doing so little. Finally, I asked, would it be all right if I played my concertina for a while? The two women searched each other's faces, uncertain about the answer. What do you think, Galena? Auntie asked, doubtful look on her face. Galena thought for a moment. The neighbors on either side of us are too far away to be bothered. The Germans in town won't hear a note. Auntie hesitated. You don't think it will draw unwanted attention to the house? I think it'll be fine, Galena said. Thank you. I went to my room, pulled my concertina out of its leather case and slipped my hands through the straps. My fingertips caressed the buttons as if I'd been without it for a year. Back in the living room, I began to play. The first notes of the melody felt as sweet as my mother's touch, pure and all-encompassing. I played a mournful folk tune my mother loved, the story of a traveler far from home. Of course, I didn't sing it, but I felt in my very bones. I must have played it for 6 or 7 minutes, eyes closed, completely absorbed in the music. But what was that sound? I knew I hadn't hit a wrong note. There it was again. I opened my eyes and stopped playing. I knew exactly what it was. Not bothering to put down my concertina, I ran to the front door and threw it open. There, yapping at me, was the furriest, most beautiful German Shepherd puppy I'd ever seen. Hello, I cried, dropping to my knees. Who are you? I stared at her golden face as I set aside my concertina and petted her with both hands, soon feeling the lick of her tongue as she said hello in her own way. Auntie, Miss Galena, come look, you won't believe it. I turned to look at them over my shoulder as I continued to pet the thick, soft fur of my new friend. When they entered the hallway, their faces didn't reflect joy or happiness or surprise. They stared past me, shock and fear in their eyes. I turned back toward the door, following their gaze. From my place on the floor, the first thing I saw was the perfectly polished black knee boots, with traces of dampness from the snow. Tilting my head back, I took in the blue-gray uniform under an open black leather coat. The peaked cap crowned by an eagle with its wings spread, its claws firmly grasping a circle emblazoned with a swastika. I stopped petting the dog and stood up slowly. I swallowed hard. The first German I was to meet face to face was a Nazi officer. He wasn't too tall, but even with his overcoat on, I could feel the strength and power underneath. His angular face was handsome, I suppose, although his skin was ruddy and rough-looking. His sharp eyes seemed to take in everything at a glance. I noticed there were 3 soldiers waiting at the bottom of the steps for him, rifles draped across their chests. Fear fluttered in my stomach. I see you've met Zasha, the man said, in perfect, unaccented Russian. So he spoke Russian without an accent. I hope we aren't disturbing you. Zasha darted inside and ran through the house. I dared not follow her. I think we were all too stunned to respond. I am Major Axel Recht, the commander of the troops currently occupying your town, he continued. He waited for a response, but we had none. As my men and I walked past your house, we heard lovely music being played. My cheeks burned. I felt as I've signed a death warrant for us all. Was that you, young man? My concertina lay on the floor next to me. Yes, sir, I answered, trying to keep my voice from quavering. Music isn't something we hear much of in the war. Would you mind if my men and I came in and listened while you played? I looked at Galena and Auntie for direction. Of course, sir, Galena answered for me. Please come this way. The armed men jogged quickly up the stairs. As they did, another soldier came running from the side of the house, yelling to them in German. To my surprise, the other guards laughed in response to whatever it was he said. A smile even played across Major Reich's lips. I soon understood why. The soldier climbed the stairs, holding another German shepherd puppy in his arms, who squirmed and fought to be set free. After a brief exchange in German, the fourth soldier set the puppy on the floor. The commander said, "And this is Thor." Thor's face was as dark as Zasha's was golden, and he was bigger and more muscular. He barked twice as if in greeting and then trotted off toward the kitchen. The major stared at me. Well? Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I led the officer and his men to the living room. Galena motioned for them to be seated. None of the soldiers removed their rifles. Two sat down and two remained standing. One of them behind the major. Auntie and Galena huddled together just inside the door to the living room. I held my concertina and stood very still facing the men, who looked alert and dangerous. I was terrified of them, especially the commander, but I was also thrilled that there were two precious dogs roaming the house. There was a wonderful accordionist in our company, Major Reich said, but unfortunately he was lost in action. I saw an emotion pass over his face so quickly, in the blink of an eye, just like it said, that I was shocked I saw it. It was deadly anger, presumably, because the accordion player was killed. It reminded me of the first thing Petra taught me at the partisan meeting. Keep your thoughts private and your expression blank. What is your name, young man? Ivan, I said, remembering how Petra said never to give more information than you're asked. What were you playing when we interrupted you? I had to think for a minute because I was still so stunned by what was happening. Winter Moon. He nodded. Play it again. I glanced at Auntie and Galena, but only out of nervousness. There was no question about refusing his request. Their expressions were set in a deliberate blankness. I let my fingers find their places on my concertina. This was one of the first songs I'd ever learned. I could play it in my sleep, which would give me time to think. The first moody minor chords filled the small parlor. As casually as I could, I examined the four guards of the Nazi commandant. They were massive men, not just tall, but imposing and beefy. Their bodies seemed ready and anxious for a fight. When the one nearest Axel Recht adjusted his cap, I noticed that he was missing most of his ear. Where was all this leading? I asked myself, desperately searching for an answer. Should I play poorly and disappoint him and hope he'd never come back? Or should I, hang on, or should I, dot, dot, dot? In a flash of insight, I knew what I needed to do. I just completed the first verse of my song. Perfect timing, I thought. I closed my eyes and let my body sway as I began the second verse, making it a little louder and a little syncopated. I felt more than I saw a slightly startled reaction of my audience. Now I began to move as I played, strutting like a dancer might, making the impassioned faces that Alik used to tease me about, twirling around as I came to the chorus. I ended the song with a dramatic hold on the second to last chord, and when I hit the last chord, I dropped to one knee and held it for several seconds. The men applauded and murmured their appreciation. Axel never seemed to take his eyes off me. I rose and took a bow, bending at the waist toward the men and then toward Auntie and Galena, just so I could catch a glimpse of them. Auntie and I locked eyes. She knew what I was doing. I could feel it. I turned away from her and smiled modestly at the Nazi soldiers. Thank you. The clapping must have drawn attention of the dogs because they came running into the living room. The men, any one of whom looked like they could fight off a group of attackers with their bare hands, murmured and smiled as soon as the dogs appeared, making little clicking sounds with their mouths and bending over and motioning with their hands so the dogs would go to them. To my great surprise, the one the major had called Zasha ran over to me. Standing on her back legs, she put her paws on my leg and begged to be picked up. Thor noticed and came over to sniff me closely. The soldiers looked disappointed. They like you, the commander observed. Suddenly, I didn't want them to like me. They were his dogs after all, and I didn't want to find out what he'd do to me if he was jealous of the attention they were giving me. I petted Zasha's head, but also tried to push her gently away from me. Thor had already moved on to see who Auntie and Galena were. So, Ivan, how many songs would you say you know? Axel Recht asked. He sat in the most comfortable chair in the room, looking completely relaxed, as if he owned the house and had hired me for the evening's entertainment. Oh, I sighed. So many. I've been playing since I was 6. I would say 100 or more. I've never tried to count. Alex made a slight nod of approval. I tried to memorize his features: the light, observant eyes, the strong nose that was turned down at the end as if it had been injured and never repaired, the high cheekbones. If I had to use just 3 words to describe what was expressed in that face, they would be intelligence, decisiveness, and cruelty. Oof. He said something in German to his guards. They looked at me and nodded, their heads almost imperceptibly. I know one German song, I offered, wishing desperately I could understand what had just been said. The commandant's eyebrows went up in surprise. Really? Yes, our music teacher taught it to us. Still Nacht in German. In Russian, we call it Silent Night. I swear one of the guards lit up like a child. It's Austrian, actually, Axel corrected me, but close enough. Never had a musician wrung so much feeling out of that simple lullaby as I did that night. Christmas was less than a month away. I'd always heard it was a particularly important holiday for the Germans, and that this song was sung all through the Christmas season. It also calmed down the dogs. They lay quietly at my feet. When I was done and the last suspended chord resolved, I knew what was coming. I'd try to make it happen with my playing, and I thought I'd succeeded. Axel stared at me after I'd finished. Then he turned to Auntie and Galina. Where are his mother and father? They are deceased, Auntie lied smoothly. I am his guardian until he's 18. How old is he? His questions had a cool detachment to them. Almost 13, Auntie answered. Her demeanor was composed but deferential, a perfect combination for this strange and potentially dangerous encounter. And you are? He said to Galina. I am her sister-in-law, she answered simply. He nodded and stood up, glanced briefly at his guards, and then smiled politely, if briefly, at Auntie and Galina. Ladies, thank you. He slipped on the black leather gloves he'd removed and walked into the entry hall with his men following. 2 of them picked up Zasha and Thor and held them tightly. Then Axel said, We're going to take Ivan with us. Galina's eyes grew wide. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but then closed it. Auntie met his gaze and said, For how long, sir? He studied me for a moment. I don't know. For the evening, for a day, for a month. My men could use some entertainment. They've been fighting hard. Again, I caught a flicker of emotion, this time disdain. It's like dislike, as if he could hardly make himself waste his time on explanations to 2 old women. We are happy to share him with you. His music always makes everyone happy, but he is such a comfort to us here. He stared at her and then let out a little sound that was like a suppressed laugh. Huh, prepare him to go. I'll only be a minute, I said, and went into my room. Auntie followed. Let's get your toothbrush, some warm socks, and your sleeping clothes, she said loud enough so the men in the hall could hear. Then she whispered to me, You did this on purpose, didn't you? You want to go. I nodded and whispered back. I played hard so they'd want to hear more. I'm going to spy on them. Even as I said it, I got a sinking feeling in my stomach. Who did I think I was going? Who did I think I was to go walking into a Nazi headquarters and expect I could be of any use to my countrymen? Don't forget some warm underwear. Oh, don't forget some warm underwear, she said loudly. But why? You don't even speak German, she whispered in my ear. I know, but if I'm there, I can see things. I can make guesses about others. I can tell the partisans what's going on. I grabbed my duffel bag and began stuffing a few necessities in it. Take your knife and put it in your boot. Come back here the minute they let you go, she said quietly. I nodded my head, reached under the mattress where I'd hidden the knife, and then froze as a terrible thought shot through me. What if they don't let me go? I saw the fear in her eyes too. If they don't, I'll march in there and get you. She put her arms around me and held me tight. Oh. Whatever happens, I'll figure out a way to get back here. I slung my bag over my shoulder. Here's your concertina case. Your coat is hanging on the back of the front door. She kissed my forehead. There were tears forming in her eyes. Hurry, before he changes his mind. Or before I change mine, I thought, but I knew it was way too late to turn back now. Oh, wow, what a chapter. Okay, I am going to post this so you can read along, and then I'll get to the next chapter. Thanks, everybody.